Welcome everybody to GoLocal Live's Where is America Going? Discussion about where the United States is, where it's been, and where we're moving on to. I want to thank everybody for tuning in on GoLocal Live and on social media, and welcome our audience for joining us tonight. We are here at the beautiful pavilion at Grace Church, an amazing new addition to downtown Providence, glass and copper, an amazing building. We want to thank them for hosting us tonight. We've got an amazing group of people who are going to help guide us through a discussion. I'll introduce first to my immediate left, Bob Whitcomb, a longtime newspaperman, I'll emphasize that. International Herald, Herald Tribune, Wall Street Journal, editorial page editor at the Providence Journal for about 20 years, and now GoLocal columnist. It's the best Sunday read going, is his column on Sundays. Next to him is Jim Murphy. Jim Murphy's a Rhode Islander from Warren and ran both of Link Almond's campaign and really has been a top-level Republican consultant over the past 20 years. He was political director to now President Donald Trump during the campaign this summer of 2016. Next to him is Kate Nagel, GoLocal's news editor. Former Hill staffer and PR consultant over the years, joined GoLocal about 5 years ago, and are also our good friend Mike Sheehan, former head of Hill Holiday ad agency, one of the largest ad agencies in the United States, and then led the Boston Globe for 3 years, ending his tenure at the beginning of 2017, I believe.
January 1st, 2016, midnight.
Midnight.
12:01-ish.
12:01-ish.
But who's counting?
3 years.
3 years,
Yeah.
exactly.
The purpose of tonight is really to take a look at, obviously, America's in a divisive nature since the 2016 election, and we wanted to take a look at where it is historically. There have been other periods of times like this, where we're going during these midterm elections and into the future. So I'm going to start off. Bob Whitcomb, how'd we get here?
We got here in our current sort of swamp because of accelerating technological change. I think it had a lot to do with it. Most of you have thought about these things too. Globalization, but I think especially accelerating technological change, which has changed the way we work, the way we live. And I think people are still trying to deal with this. I think people are anxious, hopeful about how some of these changes may work out, but I think there's more anxiety than hope at the moment. I think there's a sense that our society, culture is moving too fast. The changes are too much to integrate. And they're coming at a time when the demographics are challenging, the aging of the population. We haven't figured out how we're going to pay for such a large cohort of decrepit people like me, for example. How we're gonna pay for that. And I think another quick reaction I have to that question is that I think we're in a lot of denial. We're so stressed out by this that there's tremendous myopia about how to, pay for what needs to be paid for, taxes and so on and so forth. So I think there's sort of an element of paralysis about deciding or not deciding what we should do next.
Jim Murphy, you were the architect, one of the architects of one of the greatest upsets in American political history. If we go to the New York Times odds making going into the last week, it was about 9-1 that Hillary Clinton would win this thing. How'd we get here?
So I agree with what Bob said. I guess I would add the following. There's a book, The End of Big. And so I think related to technology, a symptom of that is that institutions that once held public respect and had some sort of, that people looked up to and took guidance from, are gone. Whether it's the church or government or business.
Trust.
There's no trust. The only thing now, if you...
I think I'd add trust into what I said. I think the speed of change is undermining trust, and this is, I think, devastating to a democracy.
I think that, whereas in politics, I think sort of political parties, I think, state chairmen and sort of the infrastructure that used to have an influence on who elected candidates or who were nominated the old backfilled rooms and conventions, that's gone. And today, if you do surveys, I think one of the only institutions that still has pretty widespread public support is the military. But with that exception, I think it's gone. And so in that environment and the technological change, I think both parties have seen a rise in influence of the more active wings of the party. And it's very much the same on the Democrat side as it is on the Republican side. So I think a combination of technology, the diminishment of the influence of institutions has allowed louder, more strident, more left of center or right of center partisanship to drown out the center. When I was saying earlier, I've been around a while, and in the Senate you had Bob Dole and Pat Moynihan and Scoop Jackson and Paul Tsongas and other, sure they were Democrats or Republicans, but they were thoughtful and they were trying to find common ground and get stuff done. I think what's happened is that those types of leaders have been really eviscerated because of lack of ideological purity on either side, and I think that is what has really brought us to where we are today.
Kate Nagel, in somewhere around October or September.
August 2015.
August of 2015, more than a year before the election, you wrote a story.
Could Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump win in Rhode Island? It was a slow news day, one of those summer months that we said, God, what are we going to do for a big story? The whole delegation was in Central Falls. I said, let me go out and talk with them about the Democratic side. Very much said, oh, he's a nice guy. He's a nice guy. But, Hillary shares most of his ideals and kind of poo-pooed Bernie. Talked with some of the really early adopters here for Donald Trump, and people said, oh, they're nuts too. And then, I republished the article after the, after the primaries. But to Jim's point, I think, the seeds to sort of the rifts, not just between the parties, but within the parties themselves. When I was on the Hill from 01 to 05 were certainly already there. The Mod Squad had completely diminished. It was already divisive back then. And I think to both of Bob and Jim's points that social media has played a huge role in being able to amplify those divisions within the parties themselves. And I think it's also empowered people that felt maybe the traditional infrastructure in either side of the party, hence seeing a Trump emerge or seeing a Bernie emerge from having that ability to be able to tap into those folks who thought that they weren't being recognized within the parties themselves. So now the Republican and Democratic Party, as we knew it 10 years ago, is, they're completely turned on their heads. So, but instead of coming to the middle, there's still no middle. It still keeps digging in deeper into deeper divides, and where we are is a huge question mark.
Mike Sheehan, you know messaging. You've branded lots of messages for lots of, and then you end up at the Boston Globe, a leading newspaper in the United States, during this huge turmoil. How did you guys handle it?
I had to call in grief counselors today after Election Day. It's not true.
Was that for the liberal media? There?
No, no, it's not at all. No, it's not. No, it's, I think my perception of, I think we're a nation that loves to be whipsawed, right? We go from, 8 years of Clinton to 8 years of Bush to 8 years of Obama to now 4 years of, well, maybe 4 years of Trump. That we love to go back and forth, but it always seems to balance out in some odd way. But it is a period of being of extremes, of going back and forth. And I think in the media is trying to figure out desperately what role they play, because true journalistic enterprises that apply journalistic standards to what they do, it takes time and money to do that stuff, and by the time they publish a story, it's already been out there in 5 different outlets, and it's really tough to compete. And newspapers being drained of resources, they don't have the feet on the street, they don't have the army of reporters they used to have. So getting to the truth is really, really difficult. And social media in particular, there's just a ton of untruths out there floating around. And so, but I think in the end, again, if I do believe that things tend to balance out over time, I think that, voters and people will become better filters.
Are we seeing, though, this reverberation, the difference between Clintons and Bushes was minuscule.
Right.
Now we're going from Barack Obama to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
This is cataclysmic. This
Right.
is the next swing back to a liberal progressive, or do we stay in a mode of, Jim, you measure these things, you look at these things?
I think Donald Trump, there were macro things at play here as well. I mean,
Talk about some of the macro things.
so
what was the number
look,
one issue that fueled
globalization, Brexit, so I think you started with, just people just generally being concerned about things weren't the way they were, the world's, so I think that was sort of an umbrella that sort of set the stage, if you will. I also think that Trump was, I think that the Trump campaign started off anti-Washington with, it's a little off-color, but Haley Barbour, former governor of Mississippi, former head of the RNC, had a great, he's very quotable, much more so than me, but he said, America was looking for the biggest middle finger it could find, and it found it in Donald Trump. And so I think there was it started there. And I think it stayed in politics, right? Where I agree that there was, that part of it was sort of an anti-big government thing, but what I think happened in the Trump campaign was that it transcended politics. And it became a cultural a phenomenon, really, where, how is it that someone who, questionable character, Access Hollywood, said all these things, I wouldn't say was bogged down with the truth, and and who everybody didn't even agree with on everything, yet they were for him. And I think it became this anti-political correctness, and then when the media hit him, it became, what, I don't care, but at least this guy's doing this. And that is why I think, with all due respect to the campaign, I think it was much larger than any campaign. And so you juxtapose that against the perfect opposite of that. He could not have had a better foil in Hillary, and Bill Clinton and George Bush being best friends, and it started with this macro socioeconomic thing that I think goes beyond U.S., and then I think Trump tapped into it, took it to a different level against the perfect foil.
He knew how to do it. I mean, he's reality TV star.
Right, he knew how to be on TV.
This is an image and sound world. People don't read much anymore, and they'd seen this guy, seemed forceful, a guy with the ability to turn things around. You're fired. I can get things done. And he'd been doing this for a long time. He's a hell of I think he's a crook myself. I know he's a crook, but he's a hell of a salesman. I don't think we can underestimate that. He knows which buttons to push. And I thought he did it superbly. I totally agree with Jim. And if you recall, I was one of those who predicted he could win.
Yeah.
This sort of, what would you call, wonkish, Mrs. Clinton, perfect foil for someone like Trump.
Well, that's my next question for Jim, as you talk about the cult of Trump and who really embraced him for that, as you said, the big middle finger. But when he faced that foil in Hillary, how much did he draw from people when they just saw the two of them, not because they embraced Trump, but they just said, I can't vote for Hillary?
You get a lot of that.
Mucho.
Well, I tell the story. The Monday morning after the Billy Bush video comes out, I'm taking an Uber from our place on the east side down, and the driver's got a Navy sticker on his car, older guy. I get in the car, and it's like he's reading off the Democratic National Committee's bullets. Trump's this, Trump's that, Trump's this. He stops in front of One Financial Plaza. I get out to go to Starbucks, and he turns to me. First time he turns around, looks at me, and he goes, well, what are you going to do? You can't vote for Hillary.
Right. Yeah, right.
Okay?
Right,
So,
right.
the buyer.
I also think
I heard that too.
Trump had two opponents. He ran against Hillary Clinton, and he ran against the media.
Yeah.
And they were explicit opponents. And he tapped into a really genuine dislike and distrust for the media. It's real.
Even though he was in the media.
It was, yeah.
He was a creature of the media.
So he knew how to pull it apart.
Absolutely.
And this is a guy who, you know, he, with all due respect, you know, even I mean, New York City is a big media market. He's used to having microphones shoved in his mouth. He's used to
fast,
saying
very
controversial
fast.
things. He was good on his feet, and so he was ready for prime time. And he's the kind of person who didn't shy away from that, but relished it.
And the more he did it, the more breathless the media became.
Oh, right. I mean, they
The more
became
apoplectic they
totally
became.
obsessed with it.
And so he just kept going, and it was a perfect foil.
And he was always dominating the news.
Yeah.
It was
So
just
we're
every
a year
minute
and a
Couldn't
half.
stop. They're
something-
obsessed with it.
We're a
When
year and a
he was
half
in
later.
Warwick, I just got to tell this story. I was in the press corps. He was in Warwick for his press stop. We were like literally corralled in sort of the back of the Crown Plaza. And they keep the press to let the guests go out. And I'm standing next to Ian Donis, and this young kid walks by, 16 or 17. He just looks at both of us, and he goes, "Media sucks." And I look at Ian, and he goes, "You talking to me?" I'm like, "I don't know you. I'm here to do my job."
So here we are a year and a half later. If we take it to Rhode Island, we've got a governor and a good economy, low unemployment, who's trapped at 40% approval. We've got a president who's at 35% approval.
I think it went up a little bit recently.
37, 38, 39, call it under 40. Are we just going to always be at this period of time for the near future in which the electorate does not feel good about those that they have placed in office?
Yeah, I think there's a generalized loss of trust, and as Jim and everybody has mentioned, in institutions, individuals. I think the way the media is structured now, in speaking the media very broadly, I think it tends to engender that mistrust and intensify it. And it's hard to see that getting better anytime soon. We don't believe anything. You mentioned Rhode Island, Governor Raimondo's, presiding over a pretty good economy. How much of that is due to her efforts? How much of that's just regional and national? I don't know. But she's not very popular. But, most leading politicians now are not popular.
I think there's
just general distrust, anxiety, just kind of sour.
Bob, how different from 1968?
In trust, you mean?
Yeah.
I think there's less
Institutions.
now. I think there's
Okay.
much less now, yeah. Across the board, all major institutions, the press, even religion has taken taken a dive on trust because of the various sex scandals, this kind of thing. But I think trust, so when I started writing about these trust things, way back when I was working for the Boston Herald Traveler, in the Coolidge administration, and we used to do stories about who's trusted. At that time, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Boston was very highly trusted. I think Richard, Cardinal Cushing was running the show, and you had the feeling, despite the tumult of the 60s, which I well remember, that the basic institutions, the major institutions in American life were solid, were okay.
Mike, you've messaged everything. You've built brands, Dunkin' Donuts, things like that. Is it that some of these messengers have aren't leveraging the power of branding and aren't leveraging how to create a viable message that connects with the consumer?
I think they're trying to figure it out. Even 10 years ago, it was much easier because it was far more linear.
Right.
When you wanted to message, television, print, you had a plan, boom, 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 and it was linear. Now it's an inch deep and a mile wide, and it's out of your control. So I think that is the really great brands figure it out. A great brand like JetBlue, they figure out how to do it, right? They've got great engagement on social media. They have really bad weekends and days, but they know how to respond. If they're taking a task in Twitter, they respond like this. And so great brands know how to do it, but it takes a long time to figure it out because it's messy, it's complicated, and you just can't buy your way through it like you used to be able to with a big fat media buy. You can't do it.
I think
You have to think.
I think the new, before, in politics, or 1,100 gross rating points a week, you could punch through a message, you'd get the reach and frequency you needed, and that would work. Now, to your word, messier, I think the key going forward, the most effective stuff is peer-to-peer. You look at Yelp. Are you going to believe a restaurant review by a restaurant critic in a newspaper, or are you going to go to Yelp and see if it's 4.6 or 3.8? You're going to believe real people, and so I think social media has provided consumers and voters to access to information that they deem more reliable than anything the candidates
Is that a
say.
good thing? Is it democratization? Is it that everybody gets a fair, it's not just the editorial page gurus over there on Fountain Street dictating what we believe?
But it's also people think Tom Petty died a day before he did. I mean, there's there's the fear factor of where are you getting accurate news, and you know, talk about fake news, and the interesting thing about the term fake news. You know, you see a lot of times in social media, people will slap that on something they just don't agree with when it is in fact actually factual. So, you know, you talk about people trying to be discerning consumers of media. You have people who will blatantly say, I just don't believe the facts that you put in front of me. I'm going to call it fake news. How do you compete with that?
It's very unsettling if you cannot agree on facts. You know, of course, the famous John Adams, facts are hard things, but, Orwell would have had a field day now. So would have H.L. Mencken, for that matter.
But people do read. I'm reminded, my mentor, Arthur Finkelstein, used to have a great story, and he said he once did a survey and said, do you use Crest toothpaste because of its advertising? And people said, no. He said, well, why do you use Crest toothpaste? He says, because it produces 42% fewer cavities. and so, people will say they don't, but they read it, and they are influenced by what they read, even though they say they don't believe it. Back in my New Hampshire days, Bill, the union leader, same thing, a candidate, do you believe what the union leader says? No. What do you think about this candidate? And then they would just, everything the union leader had been saying about him for the last month. So I do think, although people say they don't believe what they read, their opinions are influenced by what they read.
So that's subliminal.
Yeah,
obviously.
it's there.
And
Here's
there's a
day
hierarchy.
after
There's a
day
hierarchy
after
too.
day.
I mean,
But
I
I
do think that the really good major metro dailies, Washington Post, New York Times, because people do understand the work that goes into it, that there is a higher level of credibility. They're not perfect, but there's a much higher level of credibility. And they know they're biased, right? They're is the media, of course the media is biased. The media is done by human beings. Human beings are biased. The media is biased, but they understand it, and they understand where it's coming from. So I think there's a higher degree of trust. Is there a degree of trust high enough that people will pay for it so it can survive? That's the question, because it's really expensive to produce.
I agree that and I think that is the challenge for social media outlets, is whether or not they can convince people there's an editorial content. I mean, if you're going to get a story on the front page of the Boston Globe, it's checked out,
Absolutely.
the source it, get a story in a blog,
Yep.
I write it.
Yeah. No.
There's nobody checking it, yet it gets picked up and gets retweeted and gets going around, and so that's the problem.
Can these places be profitable again by selling the idea that this stuff is carefully checked out, it's layered, it may be lawyered in a controversial story, and over time, I believe, this can produce a profitable publication, whether it's online or something else. Well, we're going through this period of churn, and I think this is going to take a long while. This is all very new, remember, all this sort of social media and stuff. Facebook was invented, 2005 or something like that? We're still adjusting to this very, very fragmented presentation of news and information. And I think we have to expect that people are going to be confused, angry, and fragmented about this for quite a long while. I do believe in the long run, since it's in the sort of economic and personal self-interest of the users of this stuff, to use outlets that are reliable, within the human capacity, that the serious places will come back and start making some money.
Let's pivot a little bit. Let's talk about, we've got major elections in Rhode Island, and we've got major midterm elections across the country. What are we going to see? Are we going to see just straight up those congressional districts that are historically Republican will stay Republican? Are we going to see the House swing back violently to the Democrats? Is the Senate going to be in play? Are we going to see disruption and surprises? Jim?
I think he's looking at you.
Jim, I'm looking at you.
I was looking down.
Jim, just understand, Jim has more data than yeah, in that little black book is all the national polling
You give me
right
too
there.
much credit. But
He's got all the algorithms.
That's right.
the truth is I don't know, but since I'm supposed to, if I were a betting man, I would bet that the Democrats take control of the House.
Big, little margin, 50 seats.
I don't know. I mean, here's why. I think now, I think there has been if you believe polling, there's been an uptick. I read that CLF, which is run by Corey Bliss, who's a very capable gentleman. This is the Republican House outside game. They did a survey of 50 districts, where Hillary, the swing districts, and I guess the generic went from plus 11 Dem to plus 3. I just read that a couple of days ago. But I believe that every actual data point so far has basically said trouble. All the congressional races, the special elections, these races for judges in Wisconsin. I was stunned. Everybody talked about Ed Gillespie, losing by more than he should. But the real story was that in the state legislature, remember, it was like a tie. It was like they had to literally flip a coin to see. So I mean, they lost like 14 seats in down races. So I think the Democrats have had an excellent recruiting year. I think they have focused on, I mentioned earlier, the military. They've gone way out of their way to recruit female candidates with military backgrounds.
And rather moderate, a lot of them.
They're trying where they
trying,
can, but they're not going to get them all through the primaries, right? The parties. So, and I think that what I said earlier, I just don't see the types of extra people who voted for Trump that elected him, in Pennsylvania and that stuff. They are, I don't care if Trump says it, they're just not going to be like, hey, we need to keep control. They're against the establishment.
Right.
Okay, so I don't think they're going to vote. I think women are going to vote in large numbers. I think the Democrat base, the more liberal base, is highly energized. I think they're going to have a ton of money. And so I think it goes. I think it goes that way.
And the Senate?
I'm less certain about that because that tends to be more, focus. I mean, I know like Tennessee's a problem, but I think Manchin, so I that could go either way. I'm not as sure about that.
Mike
But-
Sheehan,
Mathematically, the Republicans are in much better position.
Yeah. I
Mike
think
Sheehan,
that's right.
you know Charlie Baker. I do. Know him well. And an aberration or the future of successful American politics?
Well, I think he's a model for what can happen. I mean, he's
Approval rating at about 78%.
highest in the country, has been from day one.
Most popular governor in the country.
Yep.
Yeah, amazing.
But he does his job. He doesn't get sucked into drama, or he does his job. He's extremely likable because he is likable. He's not faking. He can only be one person. Brilliant guy. Knows where to pick his fights. Knows where to back off, and he'll get reelected easily. And I think he should be the model. He's moderate. He's fiscally conservative and socially liberal, and I think that's what the Republican Party should be looking.
Bob Whitcomb?
More Charlie Bakers.
More Charlie Bakers.
Can we talk a little bit about the gubernatorial?
Yeah,
race
that's where we're
here?
going to go.
Okay.
Here in Rhode Island?
Yeah, here.
Yeah,
no, here in Rhode
absolutely.
Island.
We were going to
'Cause
go to
we
Bob
have a
Whitcomb and then
candidate
back to
over
you.
here. Okay.
Bob, Gina Raimondo, how can she be? It's 4% unemployment. It's cranes.
I think she'll.
What was it when she was elected?
42.
Yeah,
42.
What was
41,
unemployment when
42.
she was elected?
It
was pretty high.
7, 8,
Yeah.
somewhere around there. So highest level of Rhode Islanders employed.
Yep.
Right.
Record right now, but stuck. stuck at a
Well,
dismal
yeah, I mean,
number
she's
on-
got her own problems. She's not particularly good on television. That's part of it. In person, if you're, sitting having a cup of coffee with her, she's very engaged. She can be quite engaging. Doesn't come across very well on television. That will hurt her. Also, you've got just the Rhode Island problem we've had for a long time of deep mistrust of everyone in all institutions, and whoever the governor is apt to be unpopular. And they tend to assign to the governor in the state powers of evil and good, which exceed the powers of the office.
beyond the constitutional
You bet,
description.
yeah, whether if the economy, the economy is really bad, they blame. This is true in every state, but I think maybe particularly more so here, and it's good. The economy now is pretty good, but her presentation, her theatricality isn't very good. And there's so much still mistrust left over from our endless scandals. Everybody out here may have heard of 38 Studios, for example. So they think, you can see this now in the debate about the Paw Sox, which I was up at a breakfast a few weeks ago in Boston with the Red Sox people, and they're sort of bemused. Why does everyone here think that everyone is a liar and a thief? I said, well, that's about 400 years of history. So she's got her burden is sort of the weight of history and scandals, and not being a particularly good presenter.
Kate Nagel, you cover the governor quite a bit. Sometimes she's on GoLocal Live with you. She's very relaxed. Other times you jump her in the parking lot at press conferences and chase her down on this issue or that issue. What's her problem with communication?
Just back to Bob's point a little bit, I think she's got a lot of numbers that are just immovable. There's just folks who are never going to turn over to that side. She's not going to win anybody over.
Sexism, too. I think that is an element.
I totally agree with Bob. And you see it all the time. So she's not going to sway people. She's not going to move people. But I think the election here in 18, we've got one gubernatorial candidate sitting behind us here. It's going to be very interesting to see sort of the referendum on 16, Joe Trillo, the campaign chair here for Donald Trump, and of course the Democratic primary. Can Matt Brown really run on the Bernie Sanders, bona fides? And we've, totally done some pieces on his background as well. So I don't think this is going to be 2016 redux. Between the independents, and we thought that Matt Brown might go as an independent. There's a whole other set of circumstances that I don't know if I was sitting here to be a betting person what it looks like to play out to be from it. But a press standpoint, it's inherently fascinating, right? We always kind of say the more the merrier. We want different vantage points and viewpoints in the race, but to see can sort of that Bernie-crat or purported Bernie-crat, put forth a true challenge to her is really the big question. Of course, what happens on the GOP side, who knows?
9 candidates, 4 Democrats, 3 Republicans, a couple independents.
Wild West.
Wild West.
You've got the local Republican Party, the local Democratic Party, and then the national. Talking about Charlie Baker. Charlie Baker, a very capable guy, very charming guy too, very capable. He'd probably be a great president. I'd probably like to vote for him for president, but he could never get nominated at a Republican National Convention because of the nature of the national party. It will never happen.
If Jim Murphy was running that campaign, Jim Murphy
Well,
just
he
got
might be able to pull it off.
helped get Donald Trump elected. Jim Murphy, can you get Charlie Baker elected president of the United States?
Well, I'll say this. Here's what I would do if I could wave a magic wand. I would open up the primaries. I think that's, we started earlier talking about how the fringes, I think a good thing for America and for democracy would be to not have closed primaries.
Let people move from one party
Yeah,
to
I
the
think it
other
would
as they
encourage
are
more people
motivated.
to vote, and I think it would, not, it's fair is fair. I think that's one way that the Charlie Bakers of the world could, because it's a highly, believe me, when you sit there and you try and get, enough votes to win a nomination at a convention, which I was in Cleveland. Each state is different. They're bound on the first ballot. They're bound on the second ballot. a lot of the delegates are selected at conventions and they're Ted Cruz supporters, but Trump won the primary, so they got to vote for Trump. I mean, it's a really sort of,
And then on the Democratic side, you've
they
got
had the super delegates, which I think they're getting rid of.
Well, after the Hillary disaster, right, the super
Yeah.
delegates, even that came out of reform. It's like there's a line from a Cole Porter song, goes something like, make reformers reform, reform.
I've done 4 national conventions now, and I'll just tell you, it's a very complicated, it's a very complicated process, and it's state by state. And I think if you just sort of opened it up a little bit more, and had it be more, primaries where, both
better
Republicans
people,
and
better
Democrats
candidates.
would probably not want independents coming into their primaries. But I think if you were going to improve maybe, this divisiveness, I think you would find voters generally being more satisfied with the choices they ended up with than maybe they were in other elections.
I
So
think
if I
that's
could do
right.
one thing, that's
You'd get better
one thing I would
candidates.
do.
You'd probably get better candidates, especially for the executive positions, governor.
Mike Sheen, you launched successfully bagels at Dunkin' Donuts under your tutelage.
Well, a little bit before, but right around then, sure.
Yeah?
Yeah.
And a number of other brands and products.
sure.
Could you take a Charlie Baker and make him a successful Republican
if you
brand?
if you take out the Republican hurdles, like the party hurdles, I think it'd be very easy to sell, because you pull for him. He's successful because people pull for Charlie. They want him to succeed.
And he'll sell in Mississippi and Arkansas and
I think he would have that broad appeal.
He's got great emotional
yeah.
intelligence.
Yeah.
And,
And he's not a wise guy. He's not he listens, and I think his success is, a lot of politicians, the people who weren't polling for Hillary Clinton and weren't polling for Trump was staggering. And if to sell a product, people have to be pulling for it. People have to want it to succeed, and I think he has what it takes to. He's genuine and he's humble. He's not.
The New York Times writes these roundups of who are the Democrats to watch in 2020. Gina Raimondo makes that list almost every time. Is that viable? Is Gina Raimondo a potential? If she has a reelected to a second term and she's successful, is she a viable presidential candidate?
vice presidential.
She's a vice presidential
Well,
candidate.
we've talked about this.
From because she can deliver all 4.
That's
we
it.
might be down to
That's
3
right.
by
And
then, but
free-
all 4 electoral votes.
That's right, and free drinks on Wayland Square.
Free drinks in Wayland Square.
We've talked ad nauseum about how her national PR machine does such a kind of incredible job. She gets the good placements. She's sort of positioned that way. And there's the juxtaposition between the PR and what takes place here and her approval ratings here. So you got to wonder, does her team say, well, we don't need Rhode Island on the national stage. We can just sell the picture of pension reform, the economic gains that she's touting as she runs for governor right now. And yes, you'll have Rhode Islanders squawking to kingdom come to say it's not all puppy dogs and ice cream here. But in the end of the day, it's again just Rhode Island.
I've only met her personally. I don't live in Rhode Island, so I haven't seen much of her on television. I've met her personally a number of times, and she's very engaging, very smart. She's interesting, and if the obstacle is that she's not good on TV, that can be fixed.
Yeah.
I mean, you can be
To a point.
Yes, but you can be coached, and I think she could actually, because she's financially smart, she's engaging, and that can be fixed.
Jim Murphy, have you seen this phenomenon? I think we've seen it before around the country. Person loses popularity in their home state and tries to. Al Gore lost Tennessee.
Great example.
I think for the Democrats this time around, it's going to be what it was for the Republicans. I think it's wide open. And I think any sitting governor, Senate, that's why I think there'll be a lot of people who already are and will test the waters. I think it's frustrating as a strategist because in the end there's a little bit of luck here. There'll be a threshold thing, but who drops out or whose wife gets sick and you drop out, or the kid, it's the way.
And fundraising.
And fundraising, but that's dictated too, so, and some people pick and the media expectations matter, so I think that for any number of these candidates, I don't think any one of them, if they sat there and said to me, here's my path to victory, I would say, what are you talking about? Just go out, go to Iowa, go to New Hampshire, go to South Carolina, and hope lightning strikes. Because, you're just going to have to, I think what's important is, I think voters want authenticity, number one, and I think you have to believe in something, and I would just go out there and say it. And things will, I think that will come through. And the other thing I remember was, I always remember this, I wasn't there, but Bill Lacey, who worked with me and Bob Dole, he was Reagan's political director. He said Reagan had a story. And he said there were these two guys out at a campsite, and they were sitting by the fire, and they heard some rustling in the bushes, and oh my God, those was a bear. And so one guy started putting on his sneakers, and the other guy said, what are you, nuts? You'll never outrun that bear. He says, I'm not worried about outrunning the bear, I'm just worried about outrunning you. And campaigns are not elegant. They're not pretty. They don't have to be perfect. You just have to do better than the other person. So when you were talking about all these candidates have lower ratings, somebody's going to win. Somebody's going to get more votes than the other person.
Things can change.
And I think there's just been a fundamental recalibration and realignment over that's why Charlie Baker's such an anomaly, because in this macro environment where everybody hates all politicians and they're all liars and they're all thieves and we're all scared and nobody's doing anything, I think the new norm, I don't think, in the old days, if you had a 2-to-1 favorable, unfavorable ratio, that was kind of, that was 120/80 blood pressure, right? Now, 2-to-1 favorable, unfavorables are just not the norm. So I think you're going to have, less popular people in the end being nominated just because people are sick with the whole thing. But all you got to do is beat the other person. So I think that was a good story to remember, that nobody has to run a perfect campaign to win. They just have to run a campaign that's better.
Going to be looking for more, I'm talking about the presidential level, but I'd say some of the governorships and Congress too, more stable people. I think these things that, we've had the flamboyance in various ways. And I think the next president is going to have a reputation for being rather calm and collected. I think there's going to be a
milk
drive
toast
for that. Well, not quite.
Run
like
on the milk toast platform.
No, they can't. You can't be milk toast and run for president. You have to be. Also, we should remember, to run for president, you have to be a little crazy. It's just insane. But a week is the old cliche from Harold Wilson, a week is an eternity in politics. And there's so many things that come into play. We all remember when George H.W. Bush had 90% approval rating, then he gets beaten by the governor of Arkansas with a checkered past. So these things change very fast. The important thing in the midterms to me, unless Mueller has the clear goods on Trump, is the economy. If the economy is still, 4% unemployment, I think the Republicans do quite well. They may actually hang on to the House. It's this perception of how things are. The wallet is the most important organ for most Americans. And but if the economy starts sliding dramatically between now and next November, it would just be catastrophic for the Republicans, because the economy, which has been pushing. Now, I remind everybody the unemployment rate is 3.2% in Holland and 3.9% in Germany. This is all over the world, but of course people don't think of that. But watch the economy, and that, when I covered Watergate, Nixon's poll numbers really started to plunge when the economy plunged in '73. Remember that? They're okay, for quite a long while. Then we had the Arab oil embargo. We had this very deep recession in the mid '70s. And that's when his poll numbers really tanked.
Let me use that as a pivot point to talk about the last section, which is really the role of the media. What's the media doing? We've talked about trust. We've talked about these elements. Will voters, through this period of time, the 18 midterms and into the 2020 presidential election, will it be an economic decision ultimately, just like most races have been? Forget Russia and bots and analyticas and Facebook and all these things. But at the end of the day, people are going to walk in and say, you know what, we're a little better off than we were to go back 4 years ago. I'm going to stick with who took me to the dance.
But you mentioned media. If you see it at the national level, you talk about paying attention to the economy, but there can be something on North Korea and you can still be talking about the latest.
Well, I think that's my point, though. The media is talking about...
Foreign event, a lot of anxiety.
Well, you mean the
that
media is
could change.
focused
Well, the
on
media is
extremists.
focused on, an endless discussion, rightfully or wrongfully, about Russian influence in elections in the United States. But at the end of the day, I walk in and go, I don't know about Russian influence in the United States. I care about the fact that my...
Stormy Daniels.
Is anyone going to decide an election on...
They've already not decided. No one's surprised by it. But the media can't get off it.
Yeah, this is despite all the evangelicals on television and Pat Robertson's mansion and all that stuff, the fact is the country is increasingly tolerant of certain kinds of behavior. I think the majority of people don't give a damn, frankly. I mean, they knew that Trump was a scoundrel. They've known that Trump was I used to cover Trump too, by the way. They know he's a scoundrel, and I'd say the majority of Americans don't really care.
Did they know that Bill Clinton was a scoundrel to some degree, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it
Nothing
wasn't a
like
secret.
Trump, but yeah, same idea.
Yeah.
I
Jim?
think what's happened at the presidential level is that there used to be sort of a standard that a president or a candidate for president wouldn't do that was beneath the presidency. And what's happened over time is that our political leaders have become like celebrities.
Yeah.
And you remember what a big deal it was when Bill Clinton went on Arsenio Hall's show and played the clarinet? It was like, oh my God, a candidate for president's on nighttime TV. Now it's now you got to go see all the nighttime shows. So what's happened is that wall that used to exist, which had different standards, is broken down. And I'm not saying this is like we're going to all dial an 800 number to decide our president, but there's a blurring of those lines now, and I think that I think some people will want a more steady, but I think they might want that in the vice president. I do think we like celebrities and we like to be entertained, not necessarily governed by our president.
But I think this guy is so extreme in the undignified department that I think that, these things have cycles, obviously, and I think we're going to want somebody more dignified. And, when people think about it, it's just amazing. The president of the United States is sort of a semi-king. He's head of state as well as head of the government. And, generally, I think, even though there's much more tolerance for crazy behavior than there used to be, and sometimes depraved behavior, generally, I think most Americans want the president to be a role model. For the kids, if not for us, we're so depraved it's too late. But for the country in general, role model, and maybe not going back to Eisenhower, but something a little more respectful. And I think there will be a craving for this. I think that because I talk to a lot of kids, my own and others, and I hear this. Is that,
So we went from a president who could read beautifully off a teleprompter.
Yeah.
But nothing else. Everything's off teleprompter.
Yeah, he was lost without the teleprompter. Yeah.
To someone who tweets the most bizarre, random, impulsive thoughts.
Yeah.
It's the whipsaw. And so I would imagine, as Bob said, the next one will be moderate.
John Hickenlooper of Colorado, the governor, maybe someone like that, quite prim and
Well, with
proper.
new sports betting, you'll be able to bet on.
I'm in
Hickenlooper.
100% in sports betting.
We've talked a lot about the New York Times and the Boston Globe and CNN, but there's a major transformation in media in the United States with things like Sinclair Media becoming a major source of information across the country. It's going to be one of the leading sources of local news. Clearly has, I think unforgivingly, stated that it's going to have an angle to its ideologically to its content and has embedded that content. What does that mean for America? What does it mean for campaigns? What does it mean for Rhode Island?
I mean, I think it's, again, I think people tend to see through things. I think they watch Fox, they know what they're getting. They watch CNN, they know what they're getting. They watch a Sinclair station, they know what they're getting.
It's a little different, though. First time it's really hit the local television, which historically had a high trust ratio, that there was an ideology to the fire.
That viral video of all the newscasters saying the same scripted thing, all played over again. I mean, people turned to those people because they thought they were their local, trusted, unbiased. So that meshing of it, they don't understand when they hear that little script if they didn't hear the other.
Is there a
80
local
newscasters
TV
say the
station
same thing.
that doesn't do a promo that says, "We're trusted, we're the most trusted, we're local and trusted"?
How well will these places do in the long run if they become local echo chambers like NSNBC on the left and Fox on the right and so on? This will be very interesting because people here have said the local TV stations, I think, generally have been trusted in most of the major markets as pretty responsible purveyors of local news. You know, the commentary, well, of course, I remember not that long ago when they also had editorialists who come out and say something bland, you know, like a particularly boring newspaper editorial. They'd come out and read it. Usually the guy would be wearing a bow tie and, you know, well, glasses kind of like that. But,
Were you a media consultant to them?
Yeah, oh,
Jim,
absolutely.
how big is
That's
this
gonna
for the
change,
Republicans going into the midterm?
On this media?
On Sinclair, on this.
No, I agree that I think it's pretty transparent. You know, if you go to an Italian restaurant, you're going to get Italian food. So I think, you know, I think people know what they're going to get and they self-select. And, you know, I
The number of
it's
people who watch
self-reinforcing.
local news is so much smaller than it was even 5 years ago. I mean, there are probably more people in this room than will watch 11 o'clock local newscast tonight on a network affiliate. I mean, you have to look at the number. Oh, sorry. Are they here? It's staggering how few people actually watch like the 11 o'clock news at night.
fragmentation of where people are getting their news from, that bodes well for GoLocal Prov.
Listen.
So I think that, I think the future is where you are. I don't, you know, and I just think that people will make their own, will form their own opinions on what they think is a relatively unbiased source. And I do agree that people will feel that a New York Times or a Boston Globe or, you know, will have a higher bar before they'll print something.
Well,
but they'll say, but it's liberal, you know, so.
Is it actionable information? I mean, that's why I used to work for the Wall Street Journal, and the whole thing was, it's actionable. You can trade a stock based on that information. So I think in the long run, the places are going to succeed have, you know, actionable information. They aren't right all the time, but, you know, they're reliable. You can make a decision. Getting back to these local stations, though, I'm a little concerned of the sort of the echo chamber, the reinforcement. You know, you just go listen to stuff that agrees with you, because of course hearing another point of view is anxiety provoking. So I'm very concerned that there's going to be more of that at the local level too. And
Some people I know, they log on, they read Fox News, and they go to Huffington Post and figure the truth somewhere in the middle. You know, and then the truth somewhere in the middle.
Right. And you know, the TV news, I mean, I was listening to a commercial the other day, a radio commercial, and it was talking about a news station in Boston, and we get up at 2 a.m. to start. And they go on the Globe website.
Yeah. That's right. It's absolutely true.
and so they figure out from that what's important to report on. So that's, you know, the morning news, everything is according to this morning's Globe.
Right.
Yeah.
You mean after the weather, after the traffic?
Yeah.
Still, after all these years, that's still
It's still.
Well, much to
major
our
metros set the agenda.
Much to our peers' agitation about 9 months ago, we blocked all their Twitter feeds and said, at least if you're going to learn something from GoLocal, at least we're going to get a page view out of it, come to the site, but you're not going to be able to.
Incredibly frustrating that the Globe newsroom is feeding the newsroom of every broadcast media outlet.
And that's the last question. Then we're going to go to Q&A. You know, in this market, we have a very vibrant series of news organizations. We're an aberration. There are not many GoLocals. There's not a significant all digital platform in most cities and communities. You're seeing massive numbers of newspapers close around the country in a very good economy. what's going to happen in most cities and towns in the next 5 years, there will be no daily newspaper. What's that going to do? I call it the great opportunity. If you are a corrupt politician, you cannot wait for this day.
When you consider, early in my career, I was a reporter for the Patriot Ledger in Quincy. There are about 125 people in the newsroom. Every city and town on the South Shore of Massachusetts had at least 2 reporters, if not 3 reporters, that covered the towns. They have nothing now. It is easy pickings if you're a politician. You can have people walk in with bags of cash if you so choose. There is no one watching the store at all, and it's bad. That's a very bad dynamic, because if no one's attending, public works meetings or planning board meetings, they have nobody attending this stuff, and it's very, very dangerous, because you can do whatever you want to do.
Kate, we broke a couple stories in Cranston about a zoning change for a Cumberland Farms. The judge of the town was the lawyer for the Cumberland Farms, giving out donations. I mean, it was as convoluted a mixed up mess as you could possibly.
If that happens in Cranston, it's happening
Everywhere.
absolutely.
It's happening
It's
everywhere.
absolutely everywhere. And I was up at the State House this afternoon. Another piece GoLocal did. We were looking for an ethics form for the Coventry town manager when there were some issues with the big developer there. Ethics said, we'll look for it, and they couldn't find it. They literally had no idea whether or not this man had filed it or not. Again, that's just a Coventry situation. This is just a Rhode Island with 39 cities and towns. The ability to be able to pick through that is incredibly necessary if nobody knew this guy was giving donations, if no one knew this guy was skating through. So yeah, the bags of cash, that's a scary prospect.
Let's go to
What's the replacement? That's
let's
the
go to
problem.
Q&A. Can I grab a mic? I'm going to come around as short a question as you can. State your name first. Who do we got? Let me come on down. Are we on? Are we on? What's your name?
Ann Armstrong.
Hi, Ann. How are you?
I'm very well, and I'm going to be the next governor of Rhode Island. I don't know if you had remembered that. You had covered me before. But the question I'm asking, this August, I was in the epicenter of what was called the Boston Free Speech rallies. I had been asked to give the opening prayer and a moment of silence for Heather Heyer. And my experience on the ground so differed from what the narrative was that was being put forth in the paper. We were called Nazis and white supremacists. I'm Hebrew Catholic, mixed race, hippie pothead. My colleague is Hebrew, hippie, clergy. And the other people on the podium were Rastafarian. There were people promoting the Palestinian cause. There were people for Black Lives Matters. And there were people with signs against GMOs and Monsanto.
And your question?
My question is, there's a program called Operation Mockingbird that's from, it's been documented, has people in, like Anderson Cooper and people in the Globe, who in certain key stories tell you what you're going to report and what the narrative is. Was that one of the things that happened at the Boston Free Speech rally?
I don't know. I mean, I've been gone from the Globe for a long time. Listen, I know from experience that the Globe newsroom is 225 dedicated journalists who really want to get to the truth. There's no question about it. Are there biases? Of course there are, right? There's no question about it. But there is an editor who is dedicated to the truth. It probably kills more stories than most newspapers run, because he's not confident in the truthfulness of them, or he's just.
Our local
Yeah.
Providence Journal was the only paper in the country that bucked the narrative, and that was only because we were able to give them firsthand report. But it seemed that between the mayor of Boston saying that it was going to be Nazis and white supremacists coming and getting everybody whipped up, the scene on the ground was quite different than what the papers reported.
They're not influenced by anyone from the outside. They do their job.
Thank you.
Let's go over here. Joe Trill is running for governor of the state of Rhode Island, former state representative, and chairman of, Donald Trump campaign in 2016.
That is correct. My question is more of a rhetorical question, but I would be interested in the input of the panel. I think one of the things that's hurt the media's credibility is the fact that if you watch a news organization and you know where that reporter stands politically, they lose credibility instantly. And I think we're seeing that on the national scene. I've been 18 years in politics in Rhode Island, and I can honestly tell you, I don't know where Kate stands. I don't know where you stand. I don't know where Channel 10 stands. I don't know where Channel 12 stands. And I think that enables us to kind of preserve a certain quality and uniqueness that we have in the press in Rhode Island. And I'd just be interested if anybody wanted to comment about it.
Well, I'll comment on my social media. It's generally pictures of Bear the dog and some meals and cocktails out. And I think it's incredibly important. We've actually let some people go over the time who wanted to express their personal political opinions in social media. Mike, you had a few experiences like that at the Globe in which reporters stepped out of their role.
Yeah, you have to. I personally don't participate in social media because I just I don't know personally. I don't know anyone whose career was helped by being on social media. I can name you 1,000 people whose careers were tanked by something stupid they did. You know, when I became first CEO of Hill Holiday, I was called by one of the lawyers in town. He goes, "Don't have any email. Don't have email." He goes, "Why?" Because I've been a lawyer for 30 years. I've never had a client helped by an email. And so it is. Sometimes, and I think it's all part of the balancing act. I think people will get there. Sometimes keep your opinions to yourself. There's nothing wrong with keeping your opinions to yourself. Who cares what you think? I can't believe anyone cares what I think. That's why, so I'm going to get a Twitter account and I'm going to tweet what I think. Who cares what I think? I don't care what I think. And so I think that's where you have to.
Jim Murphy, in the presidential game, do you look at what the biases of reporters and media members were, what they were showing their hand about certain comments about presidential candidates and their own expressions?
You know, I'm more on the political side and the management side, not so much the comm side, but, I know that the professional press staff tend to know the reporters who they're talking to, and they've looked at what they've written in the past, and they know what issues they're interested in. So I think generally, if you're advising a candidate or an office holder who's going into a meeting, you can say, hey, this one might be a little rough or not so rough. So I think most campaigns feel that some interviews are going to be more friendly than others, but I think it's more a function of what the outlet is. So I think if it's a major news outlet in a market, you're going to deal with it whether you think they're for them or against them. If it's a little weekly newspaper out here who's just going to give you a hard time, you ignore it.
Even if it's radio or TV, the way you talk to people is different on radio and TV a bit.
I think it's more where the votes are, where's your targeting, where are you scheduling, where you're spending your time, and you go there and you need the exposure to get your message out in that geography, but you do your homework, sure.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Robert Lever. There's a very provocative article in I think it's the most recent Atlantic Monthly that basically said the office of the president is wrongly designed. In other words, it was basically designed for times that don't exist anymore, and that how we got Trump was because he figured out that the office no longer works and needs a redesign. I'd just be curious for your thoughts.
I mean, I think that you could say that for so much of government. You can say that about the town meeting format.
I would agree with
that too. Right, it doesn't work. It was designed for the 1800s, 1700s. The issues today are so complex. And so you see these town meetings, no one can know about the technology, waste management, these issues of fire. You can talk about anything. And I agree that he tapped into
figured it out.
Yeah, yeah. And just by fighting it and being the anti-that, he tapped into a vein.
Well,
And it was rich.
I think to Jim's point too, I mean, do Americans have a thirst to really restructure things? Do they really want to address the primary system? Do they really want to address the office of the president? That's the big question. Or at the end of the day, are they going to kind of sit back complacently and say, well, I guess it's good enough?
To your point, Kate, the author was not hopeful.
Okay.
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, I think in business, right, and I've been in business for 30, almost 40 years, you typically reinvent the company every 5 years. You strip it down to the studs and you rebuild it. And these institutions haven't been rebuilt in 200 years. Yeah.
With our 18th century Constitution. Yeah, I mean, I think we can. I think people are maybe beginning to think of things like separating, turning the president's job into two people: the head of state, head of government, more the European pattern. And I realize we hear this about every 8 years. Eventually, a third party will come along. It'll become the second party, one of the two parties. I think that will happen. I think with technology and the messaging system changing so rapidly, it could happen faster than we think. Could be somebody like Governor Kasich, for example, of Ohio, leading it. So I think there's a higher possibility of major change like that than there has been for a long time.
I think on a macro level, the thing that, in terms of changes, based on what I know, I think it would take a while, but it's also started. I think there are 10 states, I think Connecticut is the most recent, to pledge that they would cast their electoral votes for the winner nationally.
Of the
popular vote. I think that the more likely, maybe not in my lifetime, but I could see the Electoral College being under siege because and for me, I think the irony there is that it kind of really is that 10, 12 states decide the president. And that kind of goes against the fundamental, I mean, no disrespect, how many presidential candidates do you see in Rhode Island? Or Wyoming?
Federalism.
Because when you were a national political director for a campaign, whether you were me or you were Robbie Mook, you got about 32 major markets up there, and you're just flying people and surrogates around to those 32, and it really doesn't change.
Pawtucket did not get hit much this last cycle.
Ed Zesk. Hi. My name is Ed Zesk, and before you start restructuring the Constitution, which when I was a naval officer, swore to preserve and protect, I think the fundamental question here is, are we a democracy that happens to have a capitalist economic system, or are we a capitalist country that happens to have a democracy? And I think the democracy is more important. If we don't have campaign finance reform, America's going nowhere. If candidates are bought and sold, legislatures are bought and sold by oligarchs, which is essentially what's happening, we're never going to succeed and preserve the Constitution. I don't think it's antiquated. What I think has happened is it's been bought. And we need to fundamentally reform campaign finance. Don't reform the Constitution. I think the Constitution will survive. So if you really want to know where America's going, if we can't fix the electoral process, if we can't deal with a situation where someone is elected president with not the majority of the electorate, if we can't get people to turn out and actually vote because they think their vote actually means something and it's not already bought and paid for, we're in big trouble.
Bernie Sanders, a little exception to that? Throw it out there. We haven't talked much about Bernie Sanders tonight?
Well, I think a lot of people who didn't vote for Hillary because they preferred a more progressive candidate. And instead of saying, I'm not gonna vote for change, they didn't vote at all. And look what happened.
Or some of them voted for Trump.
Well, you know what? I don't want to take up too much time. I just spent 3 weeks in Tennessee. My baby sister lives there. And we live in a bubble here, let me tell you. Because there is a fundamental issue here of the fact that no one was listening to these people. No one. And I haven't heard anything come out of the Democratic Party that gives me any sense that something's being done to respond to them. And so we can talk about how bad Trump is, and I personally think he's, morally corrupt and a bad president. But who am I going to say you should have instead? I haven't seen anything come out of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, for that, you need a presidential candidate or a plausible presidential candidate to speak to that. It's all very diffuse now. The Democrats are trying to get more, the working class people. They won a couple of congressional seats, but it's very diffuse now. I think Jim would agree. It's very diffuse. We have no idea who the leader of the Democratic Party is going to be in a couple of years, and you need that to speak to that. Yeah. All right.
We got one more over here. Yes, sir.
Phil Stone. To piggyback off what he said about older people, I'm curious to hear the panel's opinion on how we can educate K through 12 students and college students, university students on the political front, on the media. What's going to happen in 10 years? How are they going to engage in politics? How are they going to find out about politics? And how are they going to separate truth from fake news?
Mike?
Well, it's interesting. I'm a graduate of St. Anselm College in New Hampshire, which has the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, which is a really important institution, not only in New Hampshire, but certainly on the campus. And I think colleges have to get more engaged like that. I mean, obviously, Jim, we both touched the Reagan campaign in 1980. I was on campus, and he was working for it in New Hampshire. But this Institute of Politics there's an event every day that students go to, and so but I think more colleges should have political. It's easy for New Hampshire because of the where it stands in the primary cycle, but you have to take an active role and make it important. It's not just liberal arts. It's not just business. That colleges have to invest in training kids for politics and get them interested and engaged.
I think the problem is a lot deeper than that. Do they teach civics anymore?
Yep.
School? I don't think they do.
No.
I think I took
Or
a
citizenship.
civics class in sixth grade. At least the basics, the three branches of government, federalism, all that stuff, the basics.
Yeah.
Most of the young people I talk to, including, by the way, graduates of extremely expensive, fancy, elitist colleges, don't know nearly as much of this stuff they should know. They don't understand the system in which they're voting, if they bother to vote. And I think that we have to reconstitute some kind of civics education in the schools. Probably, I guess, maybe the middle school, period. Yeah.
It might be good to have them pass the test that immigrants pass in order to become U.S.
Yeah,
citizens.
right, absolutely. They have to read the Constitution. I mean, I don't
That would be a start.
Yeah, but sooner rather than later. The other thing is the teaching of history, which has taken a huge hit, in my view, in the last 30 or 40 years. And I'll repeat the old cliche, but it should be repeated. If you don't know where you've been, you don't know where you're going. And we have to bring that back too, combined with the civics.
Listen, I want to thank our great panel. I want to thank them. Mike and Jim came from distances away. Jim gets the hand for the furthest distance away for
Warren?
coming into. I think he's down in Virginia
Oh, he's okay.
or something. And Mike, thank you so much for taking all the time. Kate, thank you. Bob Whitcomb, always a pleasure, and everybody for coming in today. Really appreciate you taking the time, everybody who's tuned in. Thank you for participating. This will all be cut up. It'll be out tomorrow on GoLocal, and appreciate the discussion. This is the first of many of these conversations GoLocal is going to be sponsoring. Again, I want to thank the folks at the Pavilion at Grace, and also our production team, who's just been spectacular. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in, and appreciate it. Feel free to engage on social media and send us an email as well. We'll forward it over to Mike Sheehan. Thank you, and have a great night. Thank you. Great. Thanks, everyone.